Have you ever sat down at a fancy restaurant, looked at the menu and thought, who in their right mind would pay $100 for a lobster? Or watched a celebrity unbox a tin of caviar on Instagram and figured that stuff must have been made for kings since the dawn of time? Well, here's the kicker. If you had been alive in the 1800s, you wouldn't have paid a dime for either of those things. In fact, you would have been offended if someone served them to you twice in 1 week. Because lobster? It was prison food. Literally. Inmates in Massachusetts once signed a petition demanding they not be fed lobster more than 3 times a week. They called it cruel and unusual punishment. And caviar? Bartenders used to put it out for free next to the peanuts, just to make you thirsty enough to buy another beer. I know. It sounds like I'm making this up, but I'm not. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through the strangest, most twisted food history you've never heard. 7 luxury ingredients that started at the bottom, and I mean the very bottom, and somehow clawed their way to the top of the food chain. And by the time we're done, you'll never look at a truffle, a piece of bluefin tuna, or even a chocolate bar the same way again. Because here's the uncomfortable truth nobody tells you. Expensive food isn't about taste. It never was. It's about a story. And the story is usually a lie. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's start with the biggest comeback story in seafood history. The lobster that went from jailhouse slop to $1,000 dinner. Let's start with the big red guy on the fancy plate. Lobster. You see one today on a white tablecloth with a little cup of melted butter on the side, and you think, this is the good life. And you're right, it costs a fortune. But back in the 1830s, if you were a prisoner in Massachusetts, you'd be looking at that same lobster on your tin plate and groaning. Because the prison guards served it so often that the inmates actually got together and signed a formal petition. They said, and I quote, "We demand not to be fed lobster more than 3 times a week." They called it cruel and unusual punishment. That's right. Lobster was so cheap and so plentiful that feeding it to prisoners was considered harsh treatment. Why? Because lobsters were everywhere. They used to wash up on the beaches of New England in piles so high that people didn't even bother picking them up. Farmers used them as fertilizer. Fishermen used them as bait. You could walk along the shore and grab a dozen without even getting your shoes wet. It was poor people's food, servants' food, sometimes even pig food. So what changed? The railroad. In the 1850s, the expanding railway system started carrying passengers from the East Coast to the Midwest. Along the tracks, train station restaurants needed to feed hungry travelers, and they needed something cheap. So they'd boil up a bunch of lobsters right there at the depot and serve them to folks waiting for their connection. But here's where it gets funny. Those passengers were mostly city folks. Doctors, bankers, merchants, people who had never seen a lobster in their entire lives. To them, this spiny, red, clawed creature looked exotic. It looked expensive. It looked like something a king would eat. So they told their friends back in New York and Boston, you wouldn't believe the rare delicacy they serve out west. And just like that, word spread. Wealthy people started demanding lobster at their dinner parties. Restaurants in big cities started putting it on the menu at higher and higher prices. Fishermen, noticing the demand, started catching every lobster they could find. And within a few decades, the same thing that washed up on the beach for free was selling for gold. By the 1920s, lobster was officially a luxury item. The poor man's protein had become the rich man's trophy. And to this day, it's never gone back. So the next time you crack open a lobster tail at a steakhouse, just remember, somewhere in Massachusetts, a ghost from 1832 is looking down at you and shaking his head. Because he ate that stuff every single day, and he hated every bite. Now let's talk about the little black pearls. Caviar. Today, a single tin of beluga can cost more than a used Honda Civic. Celebrities flex it. Oligarchs hoard it. It's the ultimate status symbol. But there was a time, not that long ago, when caviar was so cheap they gave it away for free. I'm serious. In the late 1800s, if you walked into a saloon in Brooklyn or San Francisco and ordered a beer, the bartender would plop down a little dish of salted sturgeon eggs right next to your glass. And you'd eat them like peanuts, because they were salty. And the saltier the snack, the more beer you'd order. It was a marketing trick. The saloon owners practically paid you to eat caviar. Meanwhile, in Russia, the czars and their courtiers had been eating the same sturgeon eggs for centuries, but they treated it like treasure. They knew something the Americans didn't. So when European royalty started traveling to Russia and tasting the good stuff, they went nuts. Suddenly, caviar wasn't just a bar snack anymore. It was a diplomatic gift, a symbol of power. And then came World War I. Here's where the story gets genuinely shady. The Russian royal family, the Romanovs, started buying up every single pound of the best caviar they could get their hands on. Not because they were hungry, but because they wanted to control the supply. They knew that if they cornered the market, they could use it as leverage, as currency, as a weapon of prestige. So the price went through the roof. And when the Russian Revolution hit, the new regime continued the tradition, restricting exports, driving prices even higher. By the 1950s, caviar was no longer a salty snack for thirsty drunks. It was black gold. And then came overfishing. Sturgeon populations plummeted. By the 1990s, the Caspian Sea was practically empty. And now, a single pound of high-quality beluga caviar can set you back $5,000. So next time you see someone eating caviar off the back of their hand with a little mother-of-pearl spoon, just remember, that person is eating something your great-grandfather could have gotten for free, if he'd just ordered a beer first. Oysters. If you've ever been to a raw bar in New York or Paris, you know the drill. A dozen oysters on a bed of crushed ice, a little mignonette sauce, $50, maybe more. But 150 years ago, in the slums of London, oysters were the McDonald's of the poor. And I'm not exaggerating. In the 1840s, oysters were so cheap and so abundant that working-class families ate them every single day, not as a treat, but because they were the cheapest source of protein you could buy. You could get a bucket of them for the price of a loaf of bread. Street vendors sold them hot from a cart, and kids would fish them out of the Thames River mud at low tide and sell them for pennies. If you've ever read Charles Dickens, you've seen them. He wrote about oyster sellers in Oliver Twist and the Pickwick Papers. In his world, oysters weren't for fancy dinner parties. They were for the starving, the desperate, and the down on their luck. They were survival food. And then the Industrial Revolution happened. Factories started dumping waste into the rivers and estuaries where oysters grew. The waters got polluted. The oysters started dying off in massive numbers. Within a few decades, the British oyster population collapsed by almost 90%. Suddenly, you couldn't just walk down to the docks and fill a bucket anymore. Oysters became rare. And when something becomes rare, two things happen. First, the price goes up. And second, someone comes along to tell you how fancy it is. That someone was the French. By the late 1800s, French chefs had started cultivating oysters in carefully managed beds. They'd pull them up fresh, put them on ice, and serve them with a squeeze of lemon and a glass of champagne. And they started marketing them, not as food for the poor, but as an experience. Oysters were romantic, they said. Oysters were for lovers. Oysters were an aphrodisiac. And people bought it. Literally. The wealthy classes started eating oysters not because they tasted good, which they do, but because it made them feel sophisticated. It made them feel European. It made them feel like they were part of something elegant. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with enjoying an oyster on a summer afternoon, but you should know the truth. That beautiful, briny little bivalve wasn't always a star. It was a survival ration. And the only reason it became a status symbol is because we ruined the rivers and made it vanish. So the next time you slurp one down and feel like a millionaire, just remember, in Dickens' London, you'd have been eating that same oyster on a paper plate in the rain, and you'd have been thankful it wasn't your only meal of the day. Foie gras. If you've ever ordered it at a French restaurant, you know the price tag. It's not something you buy on a Tuesday night for a quick snack. It's special occasion food, birthday food, anniversary food. But here's the thing, nobody tells you. Foie gras didn't start in France. It started in the Jewish ghettos of Eastern Europe. Let me explain. For centuries, Jewish families in places like Poland and Germany couldn't cook with butter if they were preparing a meat meal. That's a kosher rule. And they couldn't use lard either, because pork wasn't allowed. So what did they use? Goose fat. They'd raise geese specifically for the fat, which was perfect for cooking, because it was rich, stable, and didn't break any dietary laws. But here's the catch. When you raise a goose for fat, you get a huge, fatty liver as a byproduct. And that liver? That was peasant food. It was cheap. It was what you ate when you couldn't afford beef or chicken. The families would spread it on bread, mix it with onions, and stretch it as far as they could to feed their kids. Now, fast forward to the 16th century. The Jewish community in Rome had been making this liver for generations, and the Italian aristocrats, who lived just outside the ghetto walls, started catching wind of it. They'd send their servants down to the Jewish quarter with a few coins to buy it on the sly, because it tasted incredible. But they didn't want to admit they were eating poor people's food. Then, in the 1530s, Catherine de' Medici, the Italian noblewoman who married the King of France, brought her entire kitchen staff with her to Paris. And among those cooks was someone who knew exactly how to prepare that goose liver. She served it at a royal banquet, and the French court went absolutely silent. Then they went crazy. The king at the time, Louis XVI, became obsessed with it. He declared it the food of kings. And suddenly, foie gras wasn't Jewish peasant food anymore. It was French. It was aristocratic. It was exclusive. Today, the production method has changed. It's more industrial, more controlled, and definitely more controversial. But the price? That never went down. A single lobe of high-quality foie gras can run you $100 or more. So next time you're at a fancy bistro and the waiter brings out that little tureen of golden, silky liver, just remember, you're eating something that a poor Jewish grandmother in 1500s Rome would have served her family for dinner on a regular Tuesday. She'd be amazed you paid that much for it. Truffles. You've seen them. Those black, wrinkly, knobby things that look like a potato that got left in the back of the fridge for a month. And yet, at high-end restaurants, they shave them over pasta like they're sprinkling gold dust. A single pound of white truffle can cost $3, $4, even $5,000. So, what's the deal? Why are these ugly little mushrooms so expensive? Well, for starters, they're not mushrooms. They're a fungus that grows underground. You can't just walk through a forest and pick them. You need a trained dog, or, in the old days, a pig, to sniff them out. But here's where it gets really strange. In the Middle Ages, truffles were considered disgusting. Farmers would dig them up and feed them to their pigs. If a family was really poor, they might eat a few themselves, but only if there was nothing else. The church even condemned truffles at one point, calling them the devil's work. Why? Because they grew in the dark, they had no visible roots, and they smelled so intense that people thought they were cursed. So how did something so lowly become the most expensive ingredient on the planet? It started with a misunderstanding, a really weird one. In the 18th century, a French doctor noticed that pigs went absolutely bonkers when they found truffles. They'd dig frantically, snort, drool, and refuse to give them up. And this doctor figured out why. Truffles produce a scent that's chemically similar to a male pig's pheromone, the same stuff that drives female pigs crazy during mating season. So the doctor wrote about it. And word spread. Suddenly, truffles weren't just food anymore. They were an aphrodisiac. The aristocracy started believing that eating truffles would make them more passionate, more virile, more animal. And of course, anything that promises that kind of magic is going to be expensive. The rich started hunting for truffles like treasure. They'd pay farmers top dollar to find the best ones, and the farmers, noticing the demand, started keeping the truffles for themselves instead of feeding them to the pigs. Eventually, pigs were replaced by dogs, because dogs are easier to control and they won't eat the truffle once they find it. Today, truffles are harvested by hand, in secret locations, under the cover of darkness. The supply is tiny, the demand is enormous, and the price is astronomical. So next time you see a waiter shaving a black truffle over your risotto, just know that you're paying for something that used to be pig slop. And the only reason it's worth so much is because someone figured out it smelled like a lady pig in heat. Bluefin tuna. If you've ever been to a high-end sushi bar in Tokyo or New York, you know what I'm talking about. That deep red, almost marbled slats of fish that costs more per pound than silver. In 2019, a single bluefin tuna, 278 kilograms, about 600 pounds, sold at auction for $3.3 million. $3.3 million for one fish. You'd think that fish must have been the most prized catch on Earth since the dawn of humanity, right? Wrong. Before World War II, the Japanese didn't even want to eat bluefin tuna. They considered it trash fish. The meat goes bad quickly. It has a strong, bloody flavor that didn't appeal to Japanese palates. They'd use it for cheap canned tuna, or boil it in soups for poor families. They'd sometimes throw it back into the ocean because it wasn't worth bringing to shore. In the United States, it was even worse. After the war, bluefin tuna was ground up and sold as cat food. I'm not making that up. You could buy a can of it for your pet for pennies. So what happened? Two things. First, technology. In the 1960s, Japanese fishing boats started using ultra-fast freezing systems. They could catch a tuna, freeze it almost instantly at sea, and keep it fresh for months. That meant they could transport it across the ocean without it spoiling. Second, culture. In the 1970s, sushi started becoming popular outside Japan, first in Los Angeles, then New York, then London, then everywhere. And the sushi chefs realized something. Bluefin tuna had a unique, buttery texture and a rich fat content that made it perfect for sashimi. They started promoting it heavily, and the world went crazy for it. Suddenly, everyone wanted bluefin tuna. Restaurants in Tokyo were paying top dollar. Restaurants in Paris were paying even more. The demand skyrocketed, and the supply? It collapsed. Bluefin tuna is slow-growing and slow to reproduce. Overfishing wiped out almost 90% of the global population in just a few decades. Today, every single bluefin tuna is tracked, regulated, and fought over. The price has gone so high that only the wealthiest diners can afford it. And there are now serious concerns that the species could go extinct in our lifetime. So here's the crazy thing. In 1945, you could have fed this fish to your cat and thought nothing of it. In 2019, one of them sold for enough money to buy a mansion in Beverly Hills. That's not a food story. That's a tragedy with a price tag. Now, before we wrap this up, I need to tell you about two foods that went the opposite direction. Because not every luxury item stays expensive forever. Sometimes, technology steps in and kicks the price right back down to earth. First up, abalone. If you don't know abalone, it's that big, flat, iridescent-shelled sea snail that used to be served only in the finest Chinese restaurants. In the 1960s, Wild abalone was so rare and so sought after that it was considered a gift for emperors and royalty. A single plate of dried abalone could cost more than a month's salary. Then, in the 1970s, scientists in China and Japan figured out how to farm them. They built massive aquaculture operations, raised millions of abalone from tiny larvae, and flooded the market. Today, China produces more than 200,000 tons of farmed abalone every year. That's so much that the price has dropped by almost 90%. You can walk into a seafood market in Hong Kong or San Francisco and buy fresh abalone for about the same price as a pound of good shrimp. And here's the kicker. Most people don't even know it's cheap now. The old reputation of abalone as an emperor's dish still lingers, so some restaurants still charge a fortune for it. But in reality, you could cook it at home for a fraction of the cost. Then there's chocolate. This one's a roller coaster. 500 years ago, the Aztecs used cacao beans as currency. You could buy a slave for 100 beans. Chocolate was literally worth more than gold. Then, when the Spanish brought it back to Europe, it became a drink reserved for royalty. But in the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution changed everything. In 1828, a Dutch chemist figured out how to press the fat out of cacao beans and turn the rest into a powder that could be mass-produced. Suddenly, chocolate wasn't just for kings anymore. It was cheap enough for factory workers. By 1900, you could buy a chocolate bar for a penny. So chocolate went from luxury to everyday snack. And for about 100 years, that's where it stayed. But here's where it gets interesting again. In the last 20 years, a new wave of artisanal chocolate makers has turned the tables. They're selling single-origin, small-batch, bean-to-bar chocolate for $20, $30, even $50 a bar. They're telling stories about the farmers who grew the cacao, the terroir, the fermentation process. And people are paying it. So chocolate is creeping back up the ladder. It's not just candy anymore. It's an experience. And that, right there, proves the point I've been building toward. Value isn't about the food. It's about the story. So let's take a step back and look at the big picture. We've covered lobster, which went from prison food to white tablecloth status. Caviar, which went from bar snacks to black gold. Oysters, which went from poor man's protein to romantic indulgence. Foie gras, which went from Jewish peasant food to French royalty. Truffles, which went from pig feed to aphrodisiac treasure. Bluefin tuna, which went from cat food to million-dollar auction blocks. And abalone and chocolate, which remind us that the pendulum can swing both ways. So what's the common thread? Every single one of these foods started out abundant and ignored. Then, a small group of powerful people got their hands on them and decided they were special. The rich, the famous, the royal families, they created the demand. And once demand was high, supply couldn't keep up, so prices went through the roof. But here's the part that really messes with your head. None of those foods actually changed. The lobster you eat today is the same lobster that prisoners complained about in 1830. The caviar you pay thousands for is the same sturgeon eggs that bartenders gave away for free. The truffle you shave over your pasta is the same fungus that farmers used to throw to their pigs. The only thing that changed was perception. And perception is a funny thing. It's not based on science. It's not based on taste. It's based on who's eating it, where it comes from, and how hard it is to get. There have actually been blind taste tests. I'm talking about serious ones, with food critics and chefs, where they served expensive ingredients alongside cheaper alternatives. And most of the time, the experts couldn't tell the difference. They picked the cheap stuff just as often as the expensive stuff. So let me ask you something. If the taste is the same, and the nutrition is the same, and the history is the same, then what are you actually paying for? You're paying for the idea, the status, the bragging rights, the story. And that story is almost always a lie. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it leaves us with a choice. A pretty simple one, actually. You can keep buying the expensive stuff, you can go to the fancy restaurants, order the caviar, the foie gras, the truffle risotto, and feel like you're part of the elite. And there's nothing wrong with that. Enjoy it. Savor it. You've earned it. But at least now you know the truth. You know that the story behind that meal is a marketing miracle, not a culinary one. You know that 150 years ago, a beggar on the streets of London could have eaten better than a billionaire eating at a 3-Michelin-star restaurant today. And maybe that changes something for you. Maybe it makes you smile a little when you bite into that lobster tail. Maybe it makes you wonder what other stories we've been sold. About food, about fashion, about status, about everything. Because the pattern is everywhere. We pay premium prices for things that used to be ordinary. We chase scarcity. We crave exclusivity. We'd rather have the one thing nobody else can get than the 10 things anyone can buy. And the whole system runs on that one little quirk of human nature. So next time you're at a dinner party and someone starts bragging about the truffles they just imported from Italy, or the bluefin they had last week in Tokyo, you can nod politely. You can even enjoy the meal. But you'll know something they don't. You'll know that it was all once cheap, all once humble, all once fed to prisoners, peasants, and pigs. And you'll understand that the price on that plate isn't about the food at all. It's about the story. And now, you're in on the secret. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this and want to hear more food history that'll blow your mind, leave a comment with the one dish that surprised you the most. And I'll be back with more stories you never knew you needed.